A political upset in Fernandina Beach city elections last week followed months of controversy over a proposed chemical fermentation plant in the city's center. The bioethanol plant is a vision of Rayonier Advanced Materials Incorporated, or RYAM, the company that owns one of two pulp mills in Fernandina Beach. To discuss it, we're joined by Debra Lane, the company's vice president of environmental affairs. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
We're also joined by Mark Homans, RYAM's senior director of project management. Welcome back, Mark.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Mark, let's start out with these recent elections. The mayor and the vice mayor of Fernandina Beach were voted out. Kind of a big deal since the mayor is the son of Congressman Aaron Bean. A lot of people think it's largely due to the controversy over this plant. Both the mayor and the vice mayor supported the bioethanol plant. Everyone in office now is either against or really not in love with the bioethanol plant. So how do you think that this proposed project played into the politics of city governance?
You know, I can't speculate on that. I'm not a politician. I'm an engineer, and the project's made up of engineers and scientists, and frankly, it shouldn't matter. Who's in the seat of the city commission or even the city staff for that matter. When we're ready, we'll present the project to the city. And so the expectation is that they'll follow their process and evaluate our application fairly and objectively. And, we anticipate that to come very soon.
And we should be clear that the commission doesn't really have a vote in this, right? This is a decision that will be made by the city manager and by the zoning officials.
Our understanding is that it should not come to a vote. Their process includes a review through the technical review committee, which is mostly the city staff. And there's a couple of steps of feedback, that you get based on your application. And it is part of a public process as well.
You already have your permit from the Department of Environmental Protection. So that process has ended.
That's correct.
Yeah. And so, Debra, you wrote a letter to the Fernandina Beach News Leader. You compared this process, it's a fermentation process. You kind of compared it to beer. So explain to us how that metaphor applies.
It is a natural fermentation process, exactly the same process that you use to create beer or distilled spirits. You use bacteria, yeast, to ferment the sugars that are available in our spent pulping liquor. And then you dry that process. You basically are using a physical separation process to take the water out. That's also what happens in the manufacture of distilled spirits.
But this is a chemical process, and that matters, right? I mean, this is a process that's described in the permit itself as a chemical manufacturing of bioethanol by fermentation.
It is not a chemical manufacturing process in the sense that we're manipulating chemistry to make the process. It's a natural fermentation process. That code that's used in the air permit application is just an artifact of the way that EPA sorts emissions for their national databases. If you notice, if you go through that same process, there's a separate line for ethanol manufacture by the chemical manufacturing process, which is completely different from what we're going to be doing.
But the city's land use code prohibits chemical manufacturing. I mean, that is a forbidden use. So that distinction is no doubt going to be pretty central to the city's decision about whether or not to allow this project to go forward.
The city, like Mark said, will have to review the application that we're going to submit to the city and determine whether the project is consistent with the city's land development code. But that's a process that they're obligated to follow, and it's unrelated to what information was in the air permit application. That application doesn't have all of the information that the city needs.
But the city did ask an attorney, its own attorney, to find a firm to evaluate whether or not this met the definition of a chemical manufacturing process. And that independent attorney or land use, evaluator did determine that it was a chemical manufacturing process.
Again, Weiss Sirota made their opinion on the basis of the air permit application that was submitted. So the city can't rely only on that. They have to look at the entire application that we submit. It's kind of like saying that if we submitted an application for registration for our vehicle, that the motor vehicle people could deny us a driver's license on the basis of that vehicle registration. But it doesn't have the information they need to know to determine whether I know how to drive a car.
Gotcha. Mark, the last time you were here, we discussed this project. At the time, you were not able to talk about the emissions component because that was the subject of an administrative challenge by some citizens in Fernandina Beach. And that's sort of like a legal process, and you didn't want to step into that. But I would guess that process is over. The administrative hearing is no longer going to happen. So if we can, let's discuss. I mean, RYAM claims that there will be a reduction in air pollution with this project, the bioethanol plant. But in making that calculation, it uses data from 2014 instead of its most recent emissions data. And some people have said that sets the wrong baseline. If you used current emission data, there would actually be a net increase.
Yeah. Let me speak to that, Mark.
Go ahead,
Sure,
Debra.
sure.
And so Ann, I've been doing air permitting for almost 40 years. I started my career working for a state regulatory agency doing air permitting, and I've stayed involved with that. So, so I was very involved in reviewing this permit application before we submitted it. Air permitting is extraordinarily complicated. EPA itself has written thousands of pages of guidance documents on how that program should be interpreted, how applications should be done, how they should be evaluated by the agencies. So those baseline determinations are based on EPA's own guidance and directions. We have to look at several scenarios when we do that permitting. And in those scenarios, it is appropriate to go back and look at that baseline, because looking at some of the future scenarios, those are apples and apples comparisons. The fact is, we're going to remove sugars that are currently part of the waste stream that gets burned in a recovery boiler. When we remove those sugars, that won't be burned, and so there will not be the emissions that are associated with those sugars. Our actual emissions will decrease by 5 to 10 tons a year as a result of this project.
But why not use current data?
We use current data where that's appropriate, and in looking at the actual emissions decreases, we are basing that on current data.
Is it fair to say that if you used baseline data from 2021 or 2020, that you would see a reduction in emissions?
Absolutely. We will see an actual emissions reduction. But because of the nuances of the way permits have to be considered and looking at all the possible scenarios, you can't mix those up in the way you do the baseline analysis.
We are talking to officials from RYAM about a proposed bioethanol plant in Fernandina Beach, and we are taking your calls and questions. You can reach us at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org or reach out on social media. We have a call from Sandy in Fernandina Beach. Good morning, Sandy. Go ahead.
Hello.
Go ahead, Sandy.
Hi. Yes. My question is two-part. Mr. Homan, you sent a letter to the Fernandina Beach City Commission 8 years ago that you signed saying you would not produce bioethanol. Now you're going back on the promise. How can the community trust RYAM after breaking this promise? And secondly, RYAM has had 3 fires in the last 2 years. One 2 years ago in France, one just a few months ago at your Jessup, Georgia plant, and one just over a week ago right here in Fernandina. How is the community supposed to trust you given this kind of public safety record?
Thanks, Sandy. Mark, do you want to take that?
Sure. And let me explain what I believe Sandy is referring to. That was a letter on behalf of Lignitech Florida, which is another business we have there within the Fernandina footprint, in which a question from the community was asked, and the potential phase 2 for that project was bioethanol being considered, and the answer was no, and that is still true today. This is not a Lignitech Florida project. This is a RYAM project, and this project can exist with or without Lignitech Florida. I think as it relates to safety.
I want to stop you there
Sure.
before we move on to the fire question. So RYAM created Lignotech along with a company called Beauregard. Is
It's a
that
joint
true?
venture, yes.
Yeah. And so when you're speaking for RYAM and saying there won't be a bioethanol plant, how does that change in just a few years?
The question was about Lignitech Florida. It is a separate and independent business.
But you were answering the question.
I was answering because I was a temporary official for Lignitech at the time. That answer was on Lignitech paper. And that answer is still true, that their second phase of that project would not include bioethanol.
Can you see why that would be seen by some in the community as perhaps less than completely transparent? I mean, if you're speaking for Lignotech because you're temporarily working for Lignotech, but you actually work for RYAM and you're answering the question, will there be a bioethanol plant? And you say no. Can you see why some of the community might think that that's a little bit of a two-step?
That may be how they characterize it, but again, the sugars have always existed. in the process, and this process can exist with or without Lignotech Florida.
Explain what that means. The bioethanol can exist without
Yes.
Lignotech?
Yes.
The fact is that our process will take the liquor that already exists and has the sugars in it. We will run it through a fermentation process. That liquor will then be returned to the normal steps of our pulping process. And from there, it will either be burned in our recovery boiler or sold to Lignotech Florida. So the Lignotech business is independent of what we're doing to try to make better use of the products that we generate, the co-products that we generate, and to improve the environmental impacts around the facility.
But you don't think that it would be confusing or misleading for an official of RYAM to say there wouldn't be a bioethanol plant in a few years when there is now
There
going to
was
be?
nothing confusing or misleading about that. The question was specific to what Lignotech's intentions were, because people were determining whether they wanted to support the Lignotech operation or not. And we answered that question. We did not have this plan at the time to produce the bioethanol. It wouldn't have been economical. Now it is, because there's a desire in the world to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to do that in a way that doesn't use food stocks. So this is a 2G process that doesn't make the ethanol out of food products like corn.
Yeah. And so we sort of alluded to the fact that there was an administrative challenge filed by a couple of residents to this. And recently we had some of the people behind that on the program. They say that they were sort of strong-armed to drop that case because RYAM threatened significant financial sanctions. I mean, basically the cost of their legal battle, which could have been in the realm of about $300,000 was their estimate, would be a lot of money for any citizen to have to shoulder if those sanctions were applied. Explain why RYAM chose to use that technique to get this administrative challenge to be dropped.
Yeah, I'll take that one. When someone wants to bring a legal challenge to a permit, they have to have a factual basis for that challenge. When the petition was originally filed, the state agreed to let it go forward because they wanted to hear what that factual basis was, and that made sense. We went through the process, and it became very apparent that the basis for that challenge was incorrect assumptions based on review of our air permit application and incorrect calculations and application of the law by people who had no experience whatsoever doing air permitting. Once that's known, then that becomes what court can consider a frivolous challenge. And in that case, Florida rules allow for the party that is having to deal with that challenge to recover their legal fees from the petitioner if the petitioner wants to go forward when they know they have no basis in fact and data for their challenge. So all we did was make Mr. Budd, the petitioner, aware of that rule in the Florida rules and made him aware that we could pursue legal fees. We didn't provide any estimates of how much that would be, but we did make him aware that that's an option under Florida rules that applies to anybody that has to deal with a legal challenge.
And that's and the company believes that that's like a fair approach when dealing with a citizen complaint.
This is not just dealing with a citizen complaint. That's a fair approach available to anybody that's dealing with a legal challenge in Florida. And it's reasonable not to tie up the courts and tie up all of the resources to continue a challenge once you know that your challenge isn't based in fact. If Mr. Budd and and his attorney felt like they had a strong case, we'd still have that court hearing on the calendar. So the fact that they're able to stand out in public and make certain allegations doesn't mean that they have a basis to carry those through and be able to prove their case in court.
Well, let's talk about one of the elements of that challenge. I mean, one of the things that concerned the residents and was in their petition for an administrative hearing was this use of the word additional. There is a phrase in the permit that says that there will be an additional 100,000 tons of this fuel that's produced, this sort of waste byproduct produced, an additional 100,000 tons provided to Lignotech from RYAM. The word additional to most of us means more or extra, right? And the petition says there's going to be 100,000 tons additional of this liquor. So how would not that indicate that there is additional waste product that is going to be generated by this product? Would that not be the understanding and the definition of the word additional?
Yeah, I think that was one of the fundamental misunderstandings of the permit. In fact, and that's a corollary to misunderstanding, how much they're actually producing today and what their maximum potential is. They're permitted to do up to 100,000, but there was never meant to be another 100,000 added to what they do today.
What are they producing today?
So they've been consuming on average about 80,000.
Okay, and so their permit allows them up to
Up
100,000.
to 100.
Why does the new permit say an additional 100,000?
The permit doesn't
I don't.
authorize them an additional 100,000. It keeps them to the same levels. We're not
Yeah.
making any changes to what Lignotech Florida will do.
The language by DEP says projected future demand for the Lignotech plant is estimated as an additional 100,000 tons of SSL. That's the spent sulfite liquor, the waste byproduct. So that's the wording that DEP uses, is additional.
Remember, though, Lignotech Florida has its own operating permit because they're a separate entity from us. They have their own operating permit, and their operating permit has caps on the amount of production.
Why is that word in there then?
It's just an artifact of the way that process is evaluated and the way that we calculate what goes where in the process and communicate about that. There is no change to the amount of liquor that we will send to Lignotech as a result of this project or any other reason. They would have to go get a new permit.
Okay. We've got a call from Medardo. I believe that's Medardo Manzan. He is one of the two people that kind of helped bring this challenge. Good morning, Medardo. Go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead, Medardo.
Hello?
We're going to have to put you on hold. I don't think that we're able to take that call right now. So let's talk about the benefits of this project is, as you see it, Mark. You have done some presentations, some community meetings. There is concern about the nature of this project. There's concern about it possibly being, flammable, but you believe that it is ultimately a net good. So explain why that is.
I do. And as you said, through the development of the project over the past year or so, through these engineering phases, we've been transparent, in terms of, the information that's been available at that time. And I've done many, many presentations. I've spoke to hundreds of people. And it's pretty clear to me that the majority of the people are actually for this project when they hear that this is very much an environmentally based project. It's a large investment in RYAM, and which ultimately is cascaded down into the community. It has about 20 new jobs and also helps with sustainability of the 300 other jobs that we have there. So it has a good basis and good foundation, and we've been listening to everybody's concerns around fire safety. And so for that reason, we've spent a good bit of time and with a third-party expert on this to site the facility in such a way that in the event of a worst-case scenario around the ethanol storage tank, that the very unlikely event that all the active and passive safety measures fail and that the containment is not there, which it will be there. We displayed in our recent city town hall what that graphic would look like, and it stays well within our property boundaries and at a great distance away from the rest of the process.
And you're talking about, for instance, if the worst case scenario would be like if the ethanol caught fire somehow.
Correct. So, the study again has shown that there's different impact zones, but that those zones don't go beyond 120 meters. It's basically the length of a football field. So, and that's very important for our employees, right? The safety of our employees are paramount, and so is public safety. So that's important for when we look at, potential exposure within those boundaries. But the key is for the community, it's at a safe distance from the rest of the process. So there shouldn't be any connection between the rest of the pulping process and this project because it's nestled into the back end of the property. It's just to give you the scale, it's about 1.5 acres of over 600 acres of property that we have, and it is at a safe distance from both our process and the community.
And the concern there would be because the process involves a lot of things that are themselves hazardous chemicals that could be dangerous if they were to in sight, right? I mean, chlorine dioxide and chlorine, things like that. So you're saying that if a worst case scenario happened with the bioethanol plant and say it just exploded, it wouldn't actually reach those other hazardous chemicals and ignite them?
Let me clarify. The ethanol hazard is flammability, and there are other pulping chemicals in the process, but they're disconnected, right? I think people are conflating the two, and I understand, and I can hear that concern in my neighborhood. When we're using sort of fear versus facts, the facts are that it is a safe distance away from the rest of that process.
And so if a worst case scenario were to happen, like an explosion, you're saying that it wouldn't reach those other chemicals and ignite them.
Correct.
Okay, very good. I think we do finally have Medardo back on the line. Go ahead, Medardo.
Hello?
Go ahead, Medardo.
Yes, and good morning. There are many people in Fernandina listening to this program. So I would like to set the record straight concerning the letter by Mark Homans in 2018 concerning no bioethanol. The question that was asked by the citizens had nothing to do with Lignotech. I think Mark Homans well knows that the Land Development Code had to be modified to allow Lignotech to exist. And the question was, or the concern in the community was whether or not that change would open a Pandora's box and subsequent chemical manufacturing was made. And the way the city commission at the time interpreted that response from both Beauregard and RYAM, and by the way, the letter that Mark is alluding to was signed by him, and under his signature, it specifically reads RYAM. It doesn't read Lignotech. The letterhead was Lignotech, but his signature was representing RYAM. I have contacted already several of the city commissioners that were serving at that time, and that was exactly their understanding. It was a promise that no more chemical manufacturing would come after that, and specifically no bioethanol. So it will be interesting when the apply the permit, expect the then serving city commissioners to make their voice heard, because that's exactly why they approved the project. It was just Lignotech, no more chemical manufacturing down the road, and then we have the situation that it's trying to be changed now.
Okay,
so
Medardo.
I just wanted to make that. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I mean, he's saying that the understanding on the part of the city commissioners at the time was that there would be no bioethanol, period.
We can't.
Can't speculate on that.
Yeah,
We disagree
really
with Medardo clearly. That was in a list of a number of questions as it relates to the Lignotech project and the application for the Lignotech project. The question was clearly in phase 2, is bioethanol being considered? And the answer was no, that still remains true.
But it is now being considered, and you signed that. Is it true that you signed that document as a RYAM official with RYAM under your name?
It was on Lignotech Florida paper. I was the acting official because Beauregard is a Norwegian company. So I was the acting official. That's why I signed their permit application as well at that point in time.
All right. I want to just briefly touch on the road ahead. I mean, does RYAM believe that there has been enough engagement on this with the community? And would RYAM be willing to have further discussions with people like, Medardo, for instance, in a public forum?
I'm glad you asked that because we feel like we have been transparent. It's been unfortunate that we had this petition challenge. It really did hamper our ability to speak about all things related to the permit, right? And even prohibited us speaking with Medardo and Mr. Budd because we had to do that through attorneys. And it was a complete surprise that they went this way because, we had the open house. I'll back up to March where we had that open house. We spoke to about 170 people, and we followed up with a lot of individuals after that, including Mr. Budd, who we didn't really know, before this. And so there was 2 of our project team members that sat with Mr. Budd the next day at his house, went through all of his questions. Medardo also came to the open house. He didn't have enough time to stick around to, have his questions answered, but we decided to follow up. He gave us a phone number that we tried many times to no avail, and he has our contact information as well. So we had no reason to expect that the next time we would hear from them is through an administrative challenge, right? So that really has hampered our ability to be transparent. Nonetheless, as engineering has been developed, we have had more meetings. Recently had a city town hall where we gave a 30-minute presentation, and we're starting to share, more details that are available. And then when we make the application, for the process, we will explain why it is consistent with the comprehensive plan. We will go through all the safety measures. We'll explain the economic value and all the other touch points it has for the city. So there'll be more detail to come in that application.
Deborah, anything else that you want to touch on this project before you have to head back out of town?
Well, I think we just want to reiterate it. Mark said it earlier when we were sitting out in the waiting area. It's not often that we come across projects that have an environmental benefit baked into a project like this one does. And when we can take advantage of those projects and improve our environmental impacts at the same time, that's a win for everybody. And like I said earlier, I have almost a 40-year career in environmental protection. And so I'm really excited about this project. I'm excited about where it takes us, and I know that we can do it in a way that works well for our community.
Well, I appreciate both of you coming down to talk about this today. Debra Lane, Mark Homans, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having
Thank you.
us.
All right.